So tonight, I usually write the name of the parable, the kind of parable that we're looking at. So tonight we're going to look at the new cloth on old clothing and new wine in an old wineskin. And we find this, first of all, in Matthew chapter 9. I may be wrong about that. Where is it?
Yeah, 9, 15, 16.
There we go. Yep. The question about fasting. That's where you find it, under the question about fasting. And before we get to these verses, they're not always included in lists of parables, okay? Like Trench, his work is the classic work on the parables, and he doesn't include these in the parables. And yet, other people do. I noticed that William Hendrickson, Leon Morris, R.C. Sproul, they all refer to these as parables. There are other cases, other parables that are not introduced as parables. The writer doesn't always say, and Jesus taught them a parable saying. He doesn't always say that. But what you look for are the characteristics of a parable. So what is a parable? Yeah, earthly story to illustrate a heavenly truth. Well, we have, and some of them are very short, aren't they? Some of them are stories, and they have all the details of stories. Some of them are very short. And yet they're parables. And this is a case where we have two that are very short. And yet they have the characteristics of parables in that they're illustrations. But they're little earthly vignettes, little earthly episodes that have a spiritual meaning. And so when we get to that, it's not introduced as a parable, though most people see them as little parables. But let's read the verses here. This is in Matthew 9, 14 through 17. Now, you remember, one of the guidelines for interpreting a parable is, if it's included in another gospel, go ahead and read the other gospel account of it, because there may be some information there, another point of view. And so we'll do that. We'll start here in Matthew chapter 9. We'll end up in Luke chapter 5, and it doesn't really matter, where we end up, because it's basically the same. With Mark has just a little different take on something, but Matthew 9, 14 through 17, and this is basically what we're looking at tonight. Then the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." And now let's quickly turn over to Mark chapter 2. I'm going to hold my place here because I'll come back to the Matthew passage, though we could look at any of them, but we'll come back to Matthew. So Mark chapter 2, beginning in verse 18. John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. You see, there's a little bit of a different take there, because in Matthew it just says, "And the disciples came to him saying, 'Why do we and the Pharisees fast?' here Mark records that John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And people came and said to him, no, John tells us who those people were, or Matthew tells us who those people were. But why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with him? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. You notice Matthew said an old unshrunk cloth on an old I guess it's the same thing here. Maybe it's in Luke. If he does, the patch tears away from it. The new from the old, and a worse tear is made. Maybe that's what's different. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. And then to Luke chapter 5. You know, it's just a little bit of a different wording on some things there. Now we go to Luke chapter 5. Beginning in verse 33. Now, let's back up here in Luke. We're going to back up to verse 27. And this he went out, after this he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And leaving everything, he rose and followed him. Levi made him a great feast in his house, and there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at table with them. And the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus answered them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And he said to them, or they said to him, the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. And Jesus said to them, can you make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable. So you see that Luke calls it a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new, for he says, the old is good. Kind of interesting additional information there. Let's go back to Matthew 9. Having read the three accounts, and remember, John does not record any of the parables. Matthew 9, one of the things that we want to do is remember to look at the context. Context is always important. Jesus had just healed a paralytic. That's how chapter 9 begins. And then it's in this question about fasting and Jesus' parables are all in the bigger context of Jesus calling Matthew. Let's go back to verse 9. We read it in Luke. And Jesus passed on from there, and he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. Now, why is that such a big deal? Is it a big deal? Why? That's right. They were the vermin. They were the scum of the earth. Other Jews, if you were a tax collector, you were kicked out of the synagogue. Your whole family was like a pariah. And most families would disown you. You were an embarrassment to the family. You were just the lowest of the low. For obvious reasons, right? Because they collected tax for Rome from their brothers, and they were hated for it. But Jesus stops by the toll booth. I mean, that's what it was, a tax booth. They built these little shanty-like, like toll booths on the highway, right? You would have to, as you passed borders, and when you'd have to stop at the little booth, and the tax collector there would require you to pay your tax. And so Jesus goes to the tax booth, and he says to Matthew, a tax collector, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. So Jesus called a tax collector. Because Jesus, it didn't matter, like we saw this morning, whether you're a woman, whether you're a Samaritan, whether you are whatever you are, it doesn't matter to Jesus. He came to seek and to save that which was lost from all kinds of people. And so he called Matthew. Matthew followed him. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, there were many tax collectors. What did Matthew do? Called his buddies. They're gonna have a celebration. Hey, Jesus is coming to my house. And so he called all the other tax collectors. Now, that's a sight, in that day, in that context, that's a big deal. And they see Jesus in the house, and they are reclining. It wasn't like today where you just pull up a chair and sit at the table. You have the images, right? And that day, they reclined. They leaned on one another. And so Jesus is reclining with the rest of the tax collectors at the table enjoying a feast. This is scandalous. And there were many tax collectors and sinners. There were other sinners. Tax collectors were the sinliest of all the sinners. And they were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. His disciples are there with him. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, they didn't ask Jesus. Now, they do question Jesus, over and over again, but they're always on the short end of the stick, aren't they? They don't ask Jesus, they ask his disciples. 12, when he heard it, he said, so Jesus hears the question, "Well, those who are well have no need of a physician." Right? If you're good and you're well, you don't go to someone because you're, to a doctor. But those who are sick, well, there's a spiritual sickness. But those who are sick go to see a physician. So go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So let's take a moment just to think about fasting, the whole question of fasting, because that's the context, isn't it? Now, this isn't a lesson on fasting, but there's a few things that I can add as we think about it. As far as the Old Testament law concerning fasting, a person might think, and maybe when I was younger, maybe I thought like this, that the Old Testament, it's really tough. There's fasting going on everywhere, every day by everyone. It's fast, 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 fast. But that just isn't true. they were only required to fast one day out of the year, the Day of Atonement. That's when they were required to fast. There were other times of fasting, but they were not required by the law. People did fast at other times. You know, defeat in war, or preparation for war, or at funerals when someone died. You know, it's a time for fasting. Like Ecclesiastes says, there's a time for mourning, and there's a time to be happy. And sometimes, you know, behavior is inappropriate depending on the occasion, right? And even in their everyday lives, there were just times where fasting was appropriate. This reminds me of when I was probably, 18 or 19 years old. I have a cousin named Larry. Larry and I were really close. And Larry is hilarious, one of the funniest people I've ever known. And he and I would get together and just laugh all the time. You know, we had this little shtick we did. We went to youth groups and put on what was called the Johnny Girard Show. So I was Johnny Carson, he was Ed McMahon, he's 6'9", so, you know, kind of the Ed McMahon character. And we would just have, you know, jokes, and we would have guests come up. And anyway, just a funny guy. Well, our uncle, because he's kind of related, we're cousins, our uncle Wilbur died, and Larry and I were asked to be pallbearers. And we laughed the whole time. I tried not to laugh, he tried not to laugh. Once you get started, you look at this guy and you know he's funny and you know what he's thinking. He's thinking something, he looks over at you. He just started giggling. We laughed. We sat down in the front row, and it was hard. We laughed the whole time. Why? I don't know. We just cracked each other up. That's inappropriate. That's not a time to laugh. Now, there can be joy at a funeral, right? If you rejoice over the homecoming, you know, of a believer. But that was just inappropriate. It's not the time to laugh. There's a time for mourning and a time for happiness. And they've asked Jesus, well, why don't they fast? Now, remember that in the Old Testament, there really was only one time that they were absolutely required to fast. But the Jews, you know, were very good about adding requirements. They would add laws to protect the laws. They called it fencing in the law. And so they had a law to protect this law, and then they had to have a law to protect that law, and they just kept adding law after law after law. And in the New Testament, those are referred to as the traditions of men. God never required these things. They'd become traditions. And they were forcing people to obey the traditions rather than what God actually said. So, in the New Testament, when it comes to fasting, I see it like giving. It's assumed in places that we will fast for certain occasions, like fasting, prayer and fasting when choosing an elder, prayer and fasting over days of great distress and trial. You know, there's numerous occasions where a church might call upon its people to fast, or where an individual might feel inclined, you know, led by God to fast. But it's like New Testament giving. You know, as R.C. Sproul points out, New Testament fasting, it's free will fasting. You know, if you feel led by God, then fast. But the church doesn't force people to fast on certain occasions, unless, you know, there are certain occasions like choosing an elder, etc., where the church is encouraged to fast. And so when Jesus comes, his disciples don't fast. And that's the big problem. That's the question. Why don't they fast? They had fasts for everything. And they wanted to enforce those fasts upon Jesus' disciples. And so that's why there's a question here about fasting. You know, Jesus is at a party, basically. He's at a festival at a sinner's house. And, you know, we've noticed this, that your disciples don't fast. And so these two little parables are in that context, aren't they? So then the disciples, verse 14, I'm back in John 9, the disciples came to him, the disciples of John. Remember the disciples of John? John had his disciples, followers, you know, he had taught them. They looked to John for leadership and for teaching, but John was pointing them to Jesus, wasn't he? But they were called the disciples of John, and they came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" So the disciples of John fasted, right? John fasted, didn't he? John was this almost like a wild man, right? Coming out of the wilderness, you know, honey and locust and rough clothing and long hair, and he was a man of fasting. So his disciples fasted, but they want to know why do they and the Pharisees fast, but the disciples of Jesus do not? And so Jesus said to them, and this is a rhetorical question, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? That's a good question. So he's likening fasting and living a life following Jesus with a wedding feast and wedding guests. Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? You know, I think it was Sproul who said, basically Jesus is asking them, what time is it? Do you understand the time? This is not a time for fasting because the bridegroom is here with them. Now, what's interesting about this, does anybody have any thoughts? Let me just see. The bridegroom, as long as the bridegroom is with them. Now, he's talking about himself, isn't he? But why is that interesting? In the Old Testament, God is the bridegroom of Israel. Isaiah 62, Ezekiel 16, I think in Hosea. God is the bridegroom of Israel in the Old Testament. And now Jesus is saying, I am the bridegroom. He's likening himself to God. The bridegroom is here. God is here. How can you mourn? How can you fast when the bridegroom has come? The days will come. Now, this is interesting too. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. Now, the reason that this is interesting, let me just ask you, what do you think he's talking about here? He's saying, a day is coming, the bridegroom will be taken away, and then they will fast. Okay. That's the first part of it, right? The crucifixion, the death of Christ, he's going to be taken away. And some understand that at the resurrection, There's no longer time to be mournful. Christ is risen. It's a time for joy. It's a time for celebration. This entire period from the resurrection till the return of Christ is not a time for mourning. It's a time for joy, a time for celebration and happiness. There's another interpretation, another way of looking at it, is that the bridegroom will be taken away, at his death, resurrection, but then his coronation, right? The ascension of Christ. He will be taken away from you. So, from that point on, until he returns, would be this time where he is gone, where he was taken away. That's the other interpretation. There's two ways to look at this. Now, most go with the first interpretation, like Hendrickson and Sproul and others, that Jesus is talking about his death and burial. He'll be taken away. You can mourn then. But when he returns, it's a time for joy, a time for celebration, and will be until he returns. So that's the common interpretation of it. But some think that that doesn't occur until Christ returns. But I tend to go with that first interpretation. So that would be what Jesus is talking about here. The bridegroom's here. The bridegroom has come. God in the flesh is here. Why would we fast? This isn't the time for fasting. The bridegroom's with you. Is that when you fast and mourn at a wedding banquet when the bridegroom is in the room? No. But he will be taken away, and then they will fast. Now he illustrates it with two short parables. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. So, we say a parable Jesus draws from just everyday life, right? An earthly story, as it were. Well, it's pretty clear, this picture here. If you, I know, where I buy my clothes anyway, first time you wash them, they shrink, right? So if you have a pair of jeans or a shirt, you wash it, it's going to shrink. But after 5 or 6 launderings, it's pretty stable. That's where it's going to end up. But let's say that you have a tear in your jeans or something like that, and you buy a new patch of just unwashed denim or whatever it would be, right? And you sew it up and you wash it, and that patch shrinks. It's going to make the hole even bigger. It's going to pull those threads apart. Well, that's what he's talking about here, right? It's very simple illustration drawn from everyday life. You don't do that. It's not appropriate. It just doesn't work. Now that's an illustration concerning fasting when the bridegroom is with you. You don't do that. It's not the time. It's not the way you do it. It just tears everything else apart. And neither is new wine put into old wineskins. Now, Jesus explains it. We all know what he's talking about here. If new wine is put into old wineskins, what's going to happen? The skins burst. Why? Because of fermentation process and the off-gassing, the giving off of gas, and it expands. And that new wine needs to ferment. There's gases, and what's going to happen? It's just going to tear that old wine skin apart. And you're going to lose both. You're going to lose your wine, and you've just ruined the flask or the container for the wine. you ruin them both. So he says, if it is, the wine is spilled and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins. Why? They're both preserved, right? And Jesus is saying, this is a time of new wine. This is not a time for old wineskins. This is not a time of old wine. This is a time of new wine. There's a lot of implications there. We could draw several things out of that, like, the passing of the old and the coming of the new covenant in the blood of Christ. And you think of wine as a symbol of joy, and a wine is associated with the work of Christ, isn't it? And you have this symbolized in the New Testament church. So this is a day of new wine. And so this is why we don't fast. There was a time for that, but it isn't now. This is a time of new wine. And this is a time for rejoicing, joy, and gladness because the bridegroom has come. That's what these two little parables are all about, isn't it? So, if we just ask, so what's the main idea? I mean, I've said it, but what's the main idea here? How would you put it? Okay? The newness. The new covenant. Right? All things are new. What else? Just another way of saying it. Anybody? It's a time for joy. This is a time for rejoicing. This is a time of joy. Christ has come. It's all new. Now, they're going to struggle with this. The church is going to struggle with this. But Jesus is introduced. I mean, here we are, early days in the ministry of Christ. You think of where we're at, Matthew 9, Mark 2, Luke 5, we're kind of in the beginning of Jesus' ministry, but he's introducing this idea to them. Hey, things are different. Things are changing. Like Pastor Job has been stressing so far in the sermon series on John. Jesus is different. It's different now. Jesus has come. He's not like everyone else. And as he comes to perform his work, his ministry, he is going to suffer and die for us that we might have new life. Life abundantly, right? Abundant life. A life full of joy and happiness. And that's the point. It's new. All things are new now. It's a time of joy. So, nothing new here tonight. Like I've been saying all along, you pretty much know what these little parables are about. But maybe you have another question or just your own comment, just something you're thinking about. Mm-hmm.